Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot onto the sun-baked stones of an ancient world where sandals were optional. Democracy was experimental and personal hygiene was optimistic at best. You're not waking up in a marble palace beside a philosopher king. No, you're peeling yourself off a straw mat, squinting at a sky that's already too bright in a house made of mud brick goats, arguing outside your window, and your breakfast, it's basically flavored cardboard with a wine chaser. Welcome to ancient Greece, a place of great ideas and even greater discomfort. You might have heard about the art, the gods, the genius of Aristotle. But no one warned you about the lice, the bloodletting, or the fact that one wrong breeze could turn your linen robe into a public scandal. Let's just say, you probably wouldn't last till lunch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight and what time is it over there? I always love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting in an ancient Greek house, not the marble villa type you see in Hollywood, but the modest kind where if you pan the camera to the left, you'll probably see a goat eyeing the last piece of bread you haven't touched yet. The architecture of the time wasn't built for Instagram or feng shui, it was built to keep you from dying of heat wind or nosy neighbors. The main building material, sun-dried mud brick sometimes mixed with straw or crushed stone, forming thick walls that insulated well and were cheap enough to rebuild after one too many sincere rainstorms. Roofs were typically wooden beams covered with terracotta tiles, but if you couldn't afford tiles, congratulations, you got to live close to nature under thatch or even layered branches. The interior minimalist in the most literal sense, because most Greek households didn't own enough stuff to complicate things. You'd have a bed frame, usually wooden planks with rough cloth on top, a low table, a few wobbly three-legged stools, and a tiny hearth for cooking, heating and occasionally smoking out the relentless swarm of mosquitoes. If you were a man, your house was mainly for eating and sleeping. Most of your time was spent outside working, politicking, or discussing philosophy, or pretending to escape your wife. If you were a woman, welcome to the gynoecium, your designated area of the house where you'd spend most of your life weaving, raising kids, cutting vegetables, suppressing feelings, and occasionally hiding from your own existence. Fun fact: Greek houses didn't have private bathrooms. Bathing was a communal luxury or something saved for the end of the day if you still had the energy. Most homes had a simple basin in the courtyard where everyone took turns splashing cold water on themselves, rubbing in olive oil, and scraping it off with a strigil, basically spa day minus the spa, minus the day, minus the results. Speaking of courtyards, if you were doing okay, your house had a central one, a bright open-air space where light and breezes entered, and family arguments were conducted under Zeus witness. Around this courtyard were your rooms, bedrooms, livestock storage. Yes, inside the house, a granary for wine grain, and accumulated disappointment from tax season. Windows, technically yes, but usually tiny unglazed openings with wooden slats or cloth flaps. Looking out of them felt like prison life minus the clean uniforms. Some wealthier homes had 2 floors with a wooden staircase leading to private rooms for adolescent daughters where they could weave and dream of a marriage not entirely arranged. But most people lived in single-story cramped spaces shared with family and sometimes chickens in what was essentially a never-ending reality show. Another humorous detail: toilets. Most homes didn't have them. You might use a chamber pot and empty it in the morning, or if you were feeling urban, head to a public toilet. Basically, a row of stone benches with holes. No stalls. No privacy. Greece didn't know her. So why is Greek architecture famous? Because of the temples. Regular homes were like budget versions of greatness. The Doric columns, Ionic scrolls, and grand pediments you see in books. Those were for the gods. Zeus got a marble palace. You just needed a roof that didn't leak. In the end, ancient Greek homes had no refrigerators, no soundproof walls, no Wi-Fi, but they had warm hearths, the scent of smoke, and morning roosters. Okay. Also goats, hay dust, and the non-stop screaming of toddlers. But if you made it through summer without a snake crawling into your bed, then congratulations, you were already doing better than half of ancient Greece. You're trudging out of a mud brick house, barefoot, stepping onto stone just hot enough to roast a fig. Sweat's already beading on your forehead, not from exertion, but just from existing. In front of you is a clay water jug. No shower, no lavender-scented soap. The closest thing, a bottle of olive oil and a curved blade called a strigil. You pour oil on your skin, rub it to catch the dirt, then scrape it off like you're prepping a salad with yourself as the main ingredient. Weirdly, this doesn't make you smell better, but at least you look glossy. In a world where everyone's doing at least smelly is a kind of victory. Outside, it's the streets of Athens, no asphalt, no cars, but still a traffic jam. You squeeze through a crowd of people goats and a few philosophers arguing whether beauty needs to be useful. Spoiler, they'll debate until noon. At the street corner, a woman's smearing something white on her face. You think it's powder. Nope, it's a lead-based mix, the kind future generations will label only use if you hate living long. Back then, they called it beauty. Today, you'd call it hospital. Historians still argue whether ancient Greeks knew lead was harmful. Some records suggest they noticed something was off, especially when skin started blistering, but the price of beauty back then was accepting a deformed face as long as it was whiter than the neighbors. You're about to turn into a narrow alley when you spot a stone tablet of laws. No, it doesn't say keep the city clean. It says steal a cabbage death penalty. Yup, you read that right. Around 621 BCE, Athens got its first written legal code. And yes, it was so harsh that later generations called these laws draconian, named after Draco, a lawmaker who probably woke up and thought, biting your nails, chop the hand off. The catch: the legal system favored the aristocracy. If you were a commoner, you could be sold into slavery for not paying rent. But if you were a noble and accidentally killed someone, a quick apology, and you're good. Here's the irony: the so-called first democracy in the world didn't apply to most people. If you were a woman, a slave, or a foreigner, no voting for you. Democracy back then was like a class reunion for men over 18 with an Athenian birth certificate. You pause at the public square, the agora, where everything happens: trading, gossiping, debating, and sometimes fistfights. The air smells of olives, sweat, dried fish, and unopened philosophy books blended into a kind of city perfume. If ancient Greece had a marketing team, they'd call it Essence of Enlightenment. You sit on some stone steps. Someone's shouting, "We should attack Sparta." Another yells back, "We should tax wine." And you're just thinking, I just want a nap. Nearby young men are training in the gymnasium, not the treadmill and mirrors kind you're picturing. It's an open sandy courtyard, and yes, everyone's naked. You glance over, then quickly look away. They're not embarrassed. In fact, they're debating whether courage ties to endurance, all while slathering olive oil on themselves like they're about to be a living salad. Just another day in Athens. In Sparta, it's less romantic. If you're a boy there, you're sent to military training at age 7. No kindergarten. Just punch, kick, and endure. This system, called the agoge, taught kids that pain was necessary, and dying in battle was the ultimate career goal. Oddly, some modern scholars debate whether Sparta was really that brutal, or if its image was exaggerated by Athenian sources, their bitter rivals. They might have hated each other so much that they launched a 5th century BCE smear campaign. If you're living in Athens during the plague of 430 BCE, you've got about a 1 in 3 chance of not making it. A mysterious disease sweeps through the city as people huddle within its walls, hiding from the Spartans. No one knows the cause. Some guess typhus, flu, or even an ancient Ebola. Symptoms: high fever, red eyes, coughing blood, and bizarrely, you might still drag yourself to vote. Athenian democracy was that dedicated. Unbelievably, the city lost nearly 100,000 people, and this catastrophe all but ended Athens' golden age. From the peak of philosophy and art, they slid into chaos and eventually fell to Sparta. You know you're in trouble when you survive a plague only to lose your republic. You lean against a stone pillar, eyes closed. An old man passes by, smiling, and asks, "What do you think of the soul's nature?" You nod faintly, not because you have an answer, but because you're trying not to pass out before dinner. Your stomach growls like a prehistoric orchestra. You think of food. Then you remember breakfast, a chunk of barley bread called maza dense, as a brick dry as a desert, and about as tasty as cold ash. That's the specialty. No butter, no eggs, no coffee. Just hard bread and a cup of watered-down wine, because the water back then often had more bacteria than Plato's theories. Greeks diluted wine not to get drunk, but to avoid diarrhea. You nibble a leftover piece of bread from your cloth bag. It's so tough you wonder, is this food or a handheld weapon? The wealthy fare slightly better. They might have figs, some goat cheese, or an olive cured just enough to be elegantly inedible. Scholars still debate the ancient Greek diet. Some say it was simple but nutritious. Others argue most commoners just scraped by eating to survive, not to savor. Especially women and slaves, they ate last or separately sometimes. Just scraps. It's evening. You're hoping for a steaming hot meal, someone saying, "Please dig in." Nope, you're reclining on the floor using your arm as a pillow, grabbing small bites from a shared plate with the guy next to you. No spoons, no forks, no trays, just hands. And if he eats faster, you go hungry. The main course, lentil porridge, reheated stale bread, and if you're lucky, a piece of salted fish from last week. No fridge, no desserts. Honey's rare and only if you live near a beehive and don't mind stings. The dining room smells of olive oil, unscraped sweat, and the smoky remnants of a dying fire. A whiff of civilization if you're feeling generous. You glance at the guy next to you, wearily chewing lentil stew. Something in his eyes says, "I miss modern cheese." You smile faintly, because honestly, so do you. You scoop a third handful to your mouth and hit something, maybe once a vegetable or a root, or a very confident weed. You're not sure. You don't ask too many questions because here greens are for bulking up the meal, not for garnish. You look around, no dessert, no juice, no one snapping photos of their lentil bowl. Instead, they start singing. A poem praising wine or Dionysus, god of parties, grapes, and philosophically charged benders. The wine's diluted again, third time today, mixed with water and herbs, sipped from a clay cup called a kylix. Some start philosophizing that drinking properly is a form of moral discipline. One guy nods, another slumps over asleep. You eye a plate of fermented cheese from Lesbos, smells like a bad decision. But the ancient Greeks thought cheese was divine, a gift from the gods for digestion and spirituality. Probably because after eating it you'd pray to survive until morning. Dawn breaks, and as you're still groggy from sleep, a voice suddenly echoes through the town square. It's time to pay taxes. Yes, sorry to break it to you. There was no escaping taxes in ancient Greece. Even without email, personal tax codes, or notices pinned to your door, the tax system ran like a well-oiled machine, greased by the tears of commoners. The ancient Greeks, especially in Athens, didn't have income tax in the modern sense, but don't sigh in relief just yet. They had something called liturgies, essentially a tax of honor. If you were wealthy, you could be named and expected to fund the state. Organizing a festival, you pay. Buying a warship, you pay. Even if the city wanted to erect a giant statue in the square, they'd look around and say, that guy looks rich, let's have him sponsor it. Try refusing, and you'd immediately face a legal process called antidosis. You'd be dragged to court and forced to prove that your accuser was wealthier than you. If you lost, you had two choices: pay the cost or swap all your property with your accuser. In other words, this was the ancient version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? But if you win, you lose money. In Sparta, the system was simpler, not because they were kinder, but because they didn't care much for money. You still had to contribute in kind. Meat, wine, barley, slaves, even iron armor. And if you refused, well, you might be called a traitor and be expelled from the community. No one wanted to be the only one not invited to the honey cake feast. Foreigners living in Athens, known as medics, weren't spared either. They had to pay an annual residency tax just to breathe the same air as Athenian citizens. And if you were a slave, congratulations, no taxes for you. But then again, you had nothing to tax anyway. During times of crisis, war, natural disasters, political chaos, taxes would skyrocket. And how were you informed? Not by mail or messenger. They'd shout your name in the town square while everyone else was eating breakfast. Just hearing it could make you lose your appetite for that burnt barley cake. Strangely, in ancient Greece, paying taxes wasn't just a duty, it was a chance to show off. Many rich folks eagerly funded theater troupes, warships, or temples because it made them stand out. Their names would be carved in stone, recorded in history, and who knows, maybe even earn them a smile from the goddess Athena at night. Today, you can quietly do a bank transfer, scan a QR code, or complain on social media. But in ancient Athens, taxes were public, voluntary, mandatory, honorable, forced. A divine binary of civic sacrifice and peer pressure. Think tax evasion is bad? Ancient Greeks thought differently. If you weren't prominent enough to be named, you weren't rich enough to be resented. A small comfort like finishing dinner and realizing no one mentioned sponsoring a warship today. So if you were living in a terracotta brick house in ancient Athens with a grapevine-covered porch and a slave waving a fan nearby, brace yourself. Because tomorrow, when that voice echoes from the square, it might be your name and your little goatskin wallet. It's trembling. But if you thought taxes were trouble, welcome to the world of ancient Greek law, where logic and punishment could go drinking together, then argue in court. In Athens, the first recorded legal code was called the Draconian Law. Yes, it already sounds unfriendly. And it was, you could be executed for stealing a cabbage. Seriously. The system was so harsh, people joked that it was written in blood, not ink. The man behind the code believed the harsher the penalty, the more stable the society. He was wrong. Instead of stability, people grew fearful and angry. So just a few decades later, another lawmaker named Solon stepped in to reform the system. He abolished most death penalties and introduced punishments based on the severity of the crime. A major leap toward humanity. Still, don't assume ancient Greek law was as refined as modern systems. Trials happened outdoors in the square where anyone could watch and chime in. Juries could include hundreds of people, and their decision often depended on whether you were charming. Some even hired speechwriters to compose their defense. So if you were better at public speaking than being innocent, you had a good shot. Here's a fun fact: in Athens, you could sue anyone. Anyone. Noisy neighbors, shady fishmongers, even powerful politicians. Legal freedom was part of democracy, and also why Athenian courts were always packed like a fish market on festival day. And if you lost the case, punishment ranged from fines, loss of citizenship, to public service. Sometimes just bringing a petty case could get you fined for wasting the court's time. A kind of ancient version of spam complaints. Ancient Greek law wasn't perfect, but at least they tried to bring justice to the community through reason, persuasion, or the fear of divine wrath for lying. So next time you get a jury duty letter, smile gently. At least you're not standing in a square wearing a chiton hoping today's jurors aren't too hungry. You're sitting in a classroom in ancient Greece, no fancy desks, no whiteboards, definitely no recess bell or teachers trying to control a noisy class. Here the only thing you could write on was sand, and the only punishment wasn't a bad grade, but a swift cane from the teacher if you dared ask the wrong question. The ancient Greek education system may sound philosophical and noble, but in reality only boys got a formal education. And girls? Well, they learned to stay quiet, weave cloth, and marry early to be considered virtuous. Boys typically began their education around the age of 6 or 7. And no, there weren't any schools like we know today. Instead, you'd be sent off by your parents to the house of a teacher, a man's society called didaskalos, but you quietly referred to as the bearded embodiment of fear. What's in your school bag? A wooden tablet smeared with beeswax for writing with a pointed stylus. Think of it as the 500 BC version of an iPad. No home button, no internal memory, and liable to melt if you sat under the midday sun. The curriculum had three main parts: writing and reading, music, and physical education. And yes, everything was taught with love, mostly by yelling. You learned the Greek alphabet by copying it over and over, memorized Homer's poetry until you accidentally mumbled the Iliad in your sleep, and played the lyre not to pursue the arts, but to avoid being labeled an emotionless barbarian. As for sports, welcome to the no-clothes gym class. Morning workouts included running, discus throwing, and wrestling, all done completely nude in the gymnasium. Nobody knew why, but everyone acted like clothes were somehow an obstacle to intellectual growth. And if you're thinking that doesn't sound so bad, keep in mind, no recess, no free drinking water, and occasionally a snake might slither through your outdoor classroom. After all, you weren't studying at a certified elementary school, just someone's courtyard. There were no report cards or certificates. What you got was direct evaluation through words or occasionally a stick. If you did well, you stayed to study with a philosopher. If not, back home to take over the family olive grove and keep dreaming of becoming your village's Socrates. The gifted students advanced to rhetoric, logic, and philosophy, what we'd now call weaponized debate and intellectual gaslighting. They learned to argue so logically that if you said it's raining, they'd ask, from the perspective of Zeus or Poseidon. Sounds epic, right? Unfortunately, only wealthy boys got access to this level of education. Girls. They were trained to stay quiet, choose fabric colors, and obey. Oddly enough, despite being the birthplace of philosophy, ancient Greece had no formal teacher training. Those who knew more taught those who knew less. If you spoke fluently, you became a mentor. If you had a long beard, people assumed you were wise, even if you were just rambling nonsense. There were no diplomas, no graduation ceremonies, just increasingly difficult questions and a vague hope that learning more will make me as wise as Plato. To be fair, ancient Greek education laid the foundation for many modern ideas: logic, ethics, philosophy, and the art of endless argument. Think internet comment wars are new. Please. So, if you were a boy in Athens, you'd grow up surrounded by letters, instruments, and half-naked morning jogs in the sand. If you were a girl, well, you'd learn to bake bread, stay silent, and become someone's wife at 14. A slave's child. Sorry. Your education was simply survival. Ancient education, equal parts inspiring and absurdly harsh. A system where to learn, you had to accept being yelled at, hit, and occasionally called as dumb as an ox in ancient Greek. But if you made it through, congratulations. You might become a philosopher, or at the very least someone who could talk for hours without ever giving a straight answer. Now imagine you're sitting down to dinner with a Greek family. Don't expect a feast of sizzling meat and honey-glazed banquets like in Hollywood. Reality check. You're about to eat something. Even flies hesitate to land on bread, as hard as stone and wine. So diluted you'd wonder if someone just rinsed the cup and poured the rinse water back into the jug. Ancient Greek cuisine was far from fancy. It was a symphony of hunger, harsh natural conditions, and peculiar dietary habits. Most commoners lived on the holy trinity of barley bread, olives, and watered-down wine. And no, not the rich aromatic kind you sip at weddings. This wine was bland, thinned out to kill germs and stretch the budget. Breakfast, a chunk of barley bread, maza, round, thick and dry as sun-baked clay. Sometimes it's dipped in wine to soften, though usually that just makes it take longer to chew, like a jaw workout disguised as a meal. Lunch. Maybe a bit of goat cheese if you're lucky enough not to live in a household that bans dairy for some obscure religious reason. Dinner. Basically breakfast again, maybe with a few wild greens. And if Zeus is feeling generous, you might get a sliver of dried fish so tiny you'd need a magnifying glass to tell which way the spine runs. But don't get it wrong. The Greeks weren't ascetics when it came to food. They loved it. They were just too poor to practice that love every day. In aristocratic symposia, food was just a warm-up. The main course, philosophy and gossip. A bunch of men would sit in a circle reciting poetry, drinking wine, now diluted less, and debating whether beauty exists in the soul, while the cook behind the curtain tried not to burn the only fish, and women not invited. They ate separately often after the men had had their fill, not for religious reasons, just because Men liked monopolizing both philosophy and the serving plates. A strange truth, the Greeks rarely ate meat. Most meat was tied to religious rituals like sacrifice a bull to the gods, then barbecue it while you're at it. So if you're eating pork on a random weekday, chances are you're either a priest or a thief. Fish was more common, but your choice depended on your wallet. The rich had fresh sea fish. The poor got dried salted fish so briny you coughed from thirst while chewing. Spices very limited. Salt was a luxury in many regions. Honey was used in desserts, not tea, because tea didn't exist. Vegetables. Mostly wild greens that grew around your house, eaten out of necessity, not because anyone cared about a healthy lifestyle. And don't mention tomatoes, chili peppers, or potatoes. Europe didn't even know they existed yet. So the Greek salad of ancient times had no tomatoes. One of the most popular desserts was a sweet cake made from flour, honey, and sesame seeds. Sounds delicious, but tasted like ancient sticky candy that welded itself to your teeth. No dentists, no toothbrushes, just a wooden pick to scrape your molars or accelerate the buildup of whatever you were trying to scrape off. The Greeks were serious about eating on schedule. No midnight snacks, no food delivery apps, no fridges. Each meal was a structured event with food distributed by rank. Father eats first, then sons, then mother and daughters. Slaves. They ate in the kitchen after cleaning all the dishes and reflecting on the injustices of the universe. One thing you might not expect, Greeks hated eating alone. Eating by yourself was considered suspicious, maybe even a sign you were cursed by the gods. So if you're dining solo in ancient Greece, beware, your neighbors might drop by and ask, "Are you human or divine?" And if you were a guest, come hungry and come ready to flatter. Refusing food was rude, but eating all of it, also rude. You just took the gods' portion. Always leave a little behind, as if to say, "This is for the gods," or the cat. Whoever gets here first. In short, ancient Greek cuisine wasn't a feast of abundance. It was a long journey between barley grains and the dream of eating fresh fish once a month. Yet from these humble meals came philosophies, architecture, and cultures that lasted thousands of years, all while chewing on bread as hard as bricks. You probably wouldn't survive eating like they did, but if you held out long enough, you'd understand why they became great, and why they had such strong jawlines. A lesser-known fact the Greeks sometimes used: fermented fish as a dipping sauce. It was called gyros. Its smell was indescribable, but they believed it was delicious. One modern scholar said, if fish sauce and salted anchovies had an unwanted love child, it would be gyros. And yes, you already dipped your bread in it. Oops. Historians still debate whether gyros was gourmet or peasant food. Some inscriptions suggest it was a delicacy traded like fine goods. Others say it was budget fish sauce made by fermenting fish scraps in clay jars, buried during the heat of summer. An old man nearby says, "Back in my day, we ate soup with goat brain, lotus roots, and barley powder sprinkled with bay leaves. After eating, I remembered all my ancestors." You laugh, unsure whether it's a joke or a warning. The meal ends. No one says thanks, chef. No tipping. Just a collective sigh and someone stretching out saying, "Well then, time to oil up and listen to philosophy." You stand thinking to yourself, that meal really made me appreciate the modern world. Even instant noodles. Evening falls. You think the day is over. Dry bread, thin wine, and existential questions like, does the soul look like an egg? But no. Before sleep comes the most important ritual of the day offering. You kneel before a small home altar, a slab of white stone, an oil lamp, a few wildflowers, and a tiny statue of a god, giving you a look like, hope you didn't forget me today. Here you pray for a good harvest, health, and if necessary, forgiveness for bad-mouthing Zeus during lunch wine. Greek religious belief wasn't about a single all-powerful god. It was a whole universe of divine beings, with personalities as complex as a high school debate team. Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the skies, storms, and questionable love affairs. Hera, his wife, goddess of marriage, famed for loyalty and legendary jealousy. Athena-wise composed patron of readers and spear throwers. Poseidon, god of the sea, calm one day, throwing a tantrum the next if you litter in his bay. You didn't choose which god to believe in. You believed in all of them, and made offerings to each one depending on what you were about to do. Farming. Pray to Demeter. Setting sail. Make an offering to Poseidon. About to give birth. Pray to Artemis and pray hard. Oddly enough, you didn't visit temples weekly, like people do with churches today. You worshipped everywhere, in the kitchen, by the roadside, at the village gate, and sometimes in that corner of the yard where the goats didn't pee. Religion was part of the architecture and sometimes part of accidents. Historians still debate whether the ancient Greeks truly believed in the gods, or if they were just terrified of the consequences of offending them. Because those consequences were described in alarming detail: droughts, floods, earthquakes, and being turned into a reptile. Once a man forgot to burn incense before a trip, and rumors spread that Hermes changed the wind to get him lost for 3 weeks. And then he got bitten by a goat. True or not, everyone started offering extra bread before traveling. You light the last oil lamp and whisper quietly, "May Artemis not be angry, may Apollo not glare, and may Hades forget my name." Then you lie down on your straw mat, listening to the crickets, the scampering of cats on the roof, and thinking, "I hope I didn't accidentally step on sacred ground today." You've only dozed off for a few minutes when you're jolted awake by the sound of horns from the temple yard. It's a small festival for Dionysus, and someone has decided to kick it off at midnight. You can't see much beyond silhouettes dancing, and the smell of wine drifting on the wind. But one thing is clear: peaceful sleep is a modern luxury. Still, you stay still, listening to the fading cheers in the distance, and sigh. Well, even if there's no peace, at least there's survival. And that's the truth, because daily life in ancient Greece was a series of small, exhausting tasks, not exactly the romanticized image you see in movies. You wake just before dawn. No alarm clock. Just the first rays of sunlight slipping through a wooden shutter, accompanied by the crow of a rooster, the bleating of goats, or a neighbor yelling at their kids. You stretch, yawn, and step barefoot onto the cool dirt floor. No tiles, no carpets. The bedroom, living room, and kitchen, all one space. You could say open concept was the architectural trend of the time, not for aesthetics, but because no one could afford walls. You start the fire with straw and charcoal, heat a bit of water, and pull out yesterday's hard bread. Breakfast is once again maza, the kind of bread that could crack the ground if you dropped it. You dip it in watered-down wine, think about life, and chew like someone who has accepted their fate. Meanwhile, your wife is splitting firewood, preparing to boil beans for lunch, and teaching your children how to spin thread. No video games here. The kids play with clay, seashells, and imagination, plus a hefty dose of family responsibility. If you're a man, you leave home to attend meetings, debate politics, or practice the family trade. If you're a potter, you'll spin your wheel all morning. A farmer, you plow the land with oxen, or with your own back if you're poor. No phones, no email deadlines, just the sun above and the cracked earth below. If you're a woman, you rarely leave the house except to fetch water. You live in the gyneconitis, the women's quarters separate from the rest. No political rights, no philosophy classes. You observe the world through narrow windows. Sounds bleak, doesn't it? But then you think of modern luxuries: running water, electric lights, mattresses, washing machines, scented soap, and suddenly the neighborhood well seems like a marvel. To get water, you walk queue up and hope your clay jug doesn't break today. Here's a strange fact. On special days, Greeks would bathe by rubbing oil on their skin and scraping it off. During festivals, they even painted their skin or wore flower crowns to appear more clean. Cleanliness was relative. Researchers still debate: did ancient Greeks actually live messily or just not care about body odor? Some sources suggest perfumes made from rose and resin were popular among the wealthy. Others say tunics were washed only when things got truly unbearable. And if you're wondering where they slept, the answer is on straw mats or thick fabric on a stone floor. Pillow, a rolled-up piece of cloth. And if a storm hit that night, You just hoped your clay tile roof wouldn't collapse. You stand in front of the mirror, or rather a polished bronze plate, trying to freshen up for a new day in ancient Greece. But wait, don't reach for your foundation or eyeliner just yet. Here, beauty meant looking pale like you'd never seen sunlight. If you had a healthy tan, sorry, people assumed you were a laborer or a slave. Beauty standards back then were strange. The paler and more indoor-looking a woman was, the more noble she seemed. Enter lead-based white face powder. Yes, the Greeks mixed lead with vinegar and smeared it on their faces to achieve that aristocratic vampire look. Side effects: just mild things like lead poisoning, hair loss, skin ulcers, and organ failure. But no one cared as long as they looked white. If your skin was too rosy or healthy, no problem. Just slap on a layer of powder thick enough to plaster a statue and voile. Every morning, Greek women had a mini makeup ritual. Lead for the face, charcoal for the brows, tree resin for red lips. Yes, natural color. From pine trees, obviously. Oh, and unibrows were peak beauty. Didn't have one. No worries. They glued goat hair together and stuck it above the nose to meet aesthetic standards. People believed a unibrow symbolized intelligence, virtue, and good household management. Fair enough if you're hiring a secretary, not going on a date. Hair Greek women were proud of it. Long, slightly curled and styled into complex buns like miniature architectural marvels. They used pins, leather cords, and even gold-threaded fabric to decorate. Shampoo olive oil mixed with ash or clay. Styling heat from the oven and bronze curling rods. If you weren't careful, you didn't just lose your curls, you lost a chunk of scalp. And of course, perfume. But not the luxurious French kind with citrus and sophistication. Here, scents were made from rose petals, myrrh, a fragrant resin, and wine. Meaning you'd smell like a bouquet marinated in a grape barrel. It was all very romantic until the temperature hit 38°C 100°F, and you began to radiate like a one-person Dionysian festival. Jewelry, absolutely essential. Greek women adored necklaces, bracelets, and earrings, usually made from bronze, silver, or sometimes amber. But if you were poor, you'd wear fakes like painted clay beads strung together and hope no one looked too closely. And then there was body hair. Greek women removed most of it, partly for beauty, partly for religion, and partly because everyone else did. No Gillette razors here, they used pumice stones or sharp seashells. The sensation, like a full-body massage with industrial-grade sandpaper. Afterward, they rubbed olive oil on the skin not to moisturize, but to make it shine. The shinier and smoother, the more praise you'd get. And don't forget, all of this was done without mirrors, without LED lights, and without a beauty vlogger giving tutorials. Everything was based on touch sunlight and the reflection from an old bronze jug. If it happened to be cloudy that day, sorry, you'd look like an unfinished statue of a minor deity. In short, beauty in ancient Greece wasn't just a hobby. It was a full-time job, a social statement, and sometimes a test of survival. Because if you weren't beautiful, or worse, beautiful in the wrong way, you weren't just judged by society. You might be accused of immodesty, bewitching men with magic, or even discussed at the public square. And yet, despite the health risks, itchy lead powder, or the pain of shell-waxing Greek women still pursued beauty. Because even in a world where a misplaced eyelash could anger the gods, the desire to be attractive burned as strong as wine with a little less water than usual. And you know what? Once you nailed the ancient Greek beauty ideal, you didn't need Tinder. Just step outside and some philosopher might declare, she is the embodiment of truth, goodness, and beauty. You're standing in ancient Athens. The sun blazes overhead like Apollo himself is trying to roast your skin into crispy pita. Sweat trickles down your back, clinging to your woolen robe, and you think, I need a bath. Well, okay. But forget about private showers, hot and cold settings, or that cute lavender soap bar. Because bathing in ancient Greece was a full journey complete with cold water, olive oil, and lots of naked strangers. Bathing wasn't private. In fact, the idea of privacy barely existed. Want to bathe alone? Sorry. Greece does not support that feature. Instead, people gathered at public baths, often large stone pools or wells where you'd run into neighbors, politicians, philosophers, and sometimes doctors experimenting with cold water therapy for joint pain. The ritual began by rubbing olive oil all over your body. Sounds glamorous, like a Mediterranean spa prep, but it was actually to collect all the sweat and dirt into a sticky layer. Then you'd scrape it all off using a strigil, a curved bronze blade. No soap, no lavender body wash, just oil and metal. Then rinse with cold water as naturally as you'd wash a crusty old dish. Done bathing. Good. Now for the delicate matter. You feel nature calling. But how? No porcelain toilets, no flush buttons, no triple-ply peppermint-scented toilet paper. Welcome to the public toilet. A long row of stone seats with holes in them, all lined up with no dividers, no curtains. You sat next to strangers discussing grape taxes, wars with Sparta, or a new poet scandal, all while concentrating on your business. And if you ask, why not wait until it's empty? Sorry, Greece doesn't support that feature either. Everything was communal. And there's more. Toilet paper doesn't exist. Instead, Greeks used smooth pebbles, or a stick, with a sponge called a xylospongium, loosely translated as the friendly wipe stick. And yes, you shared it. Rinse between users and pass it along. If you're last in line, don't ask too many questions, just pray. Zeus is feeling merciful today. If you were a guest at a fancy dinner, the host might offer a side facility, basically a hole out back with a roof and no light. You brought your own oil lamp or just a sense of adventure. Going to the toilet at night felt like entering a survival game. One wrong step and you're in the pit. No GPS, no signs, just your nose and blind faith. At night, if nature called, you didn't go outside. You used a clay chamber pot, and then depends. Some dumped it in a drain, others just flung it out the window. This is why Greeks never walked too close to walls, especially after dark. Imagine a moonlit stroll and suddenly a gift from above. Goodbye, romance. But don't mistake all this for sloppiness. Ancient Greeks were actually very serious about hygiene. Bathing was cultural, spiritual, even sacred. People believed bathing cleansed not only the body, but the soul. So don't be surprised if you see someone scraping oil off while murmuring prayers to Apollo, asking forgiveness for lying to their mother-in-law. Especially before entering a temple, one had to bathe. No one wanted to offer gifts to Hera while still carrying the echoes of spoiled breakfast greens. Bathing was also a ritual before weddings, births, and even after funerals to purify the body from impurity and negative energy. And what about deodorant? There were no roll-ons, but there was perfume made from tree resin and dried flowers. The Greeks loved smelling pleasant, or at least better than their neighbors. Ladies dabbed fragrance behind their ears, on their wrists, or lightly misted their hair. As for the gentlemen, they bathed less, used more oil, and prayed no one stood too close. In short, going to the toilet and bathing in ancient Greece wasn't a private affair. It was a public experience, challenging, communal, and deeply social. If you wanted to feel connected to your community, sit beside a philosopher pondering the immortality of the soul, while both of you waited your turn to scrape off oil. If you're afraid of bacteria, forget the concept altogether. Bacteria hadn't been invented in human thought yet. You might not survive in a world without porcelain toilets or foamy soap, but the Greeks did, and gloriously so, surrounded by olive oil pebbles and public bathhouses. Not because they were cleaner than us, but because they viewed physical cleanliness as just as sacred as spiritual purity. And you know what? After a full day of sweat oil philosophy and political analysis by the fountain, maybe they truly deserve to be called the champions of fragrant adversity. You've just finished a piece of barley bread hard as a brick and salty as Athena's tears when someone forgot to offer cake during a ritual. Your throat is dry, and out of modern reflex, you reach for, wait. There's no blue-capped bottled water here. No taps, no reverse osmosis filters, and no cold glass clinking with ice. In ancient Greece, drinking water was a serious issue, sometimes a health risk, sometimes a mythological gamble. Were there wells? Yes. But don't picture a cute stone well from a Disney movie. Greek wells were deep pits lined with stones or bricks, sometimes within wealthy homes, but most people had to go to public sources, especially fountain houses in town squares or villages. There you queued up, filled your clay jar, and carried it home. Every water run doubled as a light gym workout for your shoulders, and if you went at noon, it was also a free sauna session. Public well water wasn't filtered, no chlorine, no UV sanitation. Sometimes clean, sometimes murky, and occasionally flavored faintly like goat feet. Not a prank, just a consequence of no sanitation systems and homes built near animal pens, and when it rained everything flowed, including into the well. So how did Greeks drink water and not die? The answer, they mixed it with wine. Sounds backwards, but it was genius. During meals, ancient Greeks didn't drink straight wine like that uncle at your cousin's wedding. They mixed wine with water, usually at a 1:2 or 1:3 ratio. Not to avoid drunkenness, but because water wasn't always safe, and wine had mild disinfecting properties plus some grape flavor to soften life's bitterness. Fun fact, drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric. Only Thracians or unruly soldiers drank it straight. Polite Athenians used a crater, a large mixing bowl, then served diluted wine in small cups. They drank not to get drunk, but to talk, philosophize, and convince each other that life had meaning. There was also spring water, but that came with conditions. If you lived near the mountains, spring water could be fresh and clean. If you lived in the city, spring water was a luxury. You might walk half a day just to fill one jar, and on the way back you had to avoid mountain goats trying to knock you off a cliff. Another option, rainwater. Some wealthy homes built rain-catching systems that funneled water into storage basins. Sounds clever, right? But don't forget, ancient Greek roofs were made of half-fired tiles or raw clay and covered in dust. So after a rain, your water might come with hints of terracotta ash, and if lucky, nothing worse. Sometimes they boiled water, but not often. Boiling took time, and fuel and firewood wasn't always available. No gas stove to turn on while scrolling TikTok. Every pot of safe water required a mini martial arts session, lighting the fire, guarding the pot, fanning the coals, all for a sip that wouldn't kill you. So most of the time they accepted the risk, drank what the gods gave, and hoped they wouldn't be punished for unknowingly ingesting spiral-shaped bacteria. That's also why many people offered a bit of water to the gods before drinking, a plea for safety. Or at least a scapegoat if something went wrong. Sorry, Zeus, I did offer some. In ancient Greece, drinking water wasn't simple. It was a test of faith, fitness, and luck. You didn't just turn on a tap and fill a glass. You had to walk, carry, visually inspect, and usually mix in some wine as a survival hack. So if today you can press a button for pure cold, lots of ice, remember. In old Athens, one safe sip was already worthy of a hymn to Poseidon. Giving birth in ancient Greece was a true life and death game. No obstetricians, no epidurals, no soft music in the delivery room. Just a midwife, olive oil, a birthing stool with a hole in it, and a deep belief that if you died, pushing at least you'd fulfilled the sacred duty of womanhood. You don't go to a hospital. You give birth right at home, usually in a small room with the door shut and only women allowed inside. No husband holding your hand. No video capturing the miraculous moment. If anything, there's an older midwife with arms twice the size of yours, experience passed down through 3 generations, and a gaze that's calm and just a little tired. Ancient Greek women didn't lie down to give birth. They sat on a special birthing stool with a hole in the middle, kind of like a modern toilet seat, but far less comfortable. 2 other women would hold your shoulders, or sometimes your knees, to keep you from slipping off the stool in a moment of agony, strong enough to launch you straight out the window. There's no medication to dull the pain, no epidural, no laughing gas, and certainly no soothing Spotify playlist. Instead, they'd rub olive oil on your belly or wine on your temples, not to get drunk, but for luck. Some families would place protective charms by the bedside, tiny statues of Artemis, goddess of childbirth, with prayers like, "Please don't take her today, we still owe money for last month's wine." And if things go well, meaning you're alive, and the baby's breathing, congratulations, but it's not over. The midwife would cut the cord with a bronze knife, rinse things with diluted wine, because wine is always the answer, isn't it, and wrap the baby in a stiff linen cloth. No diapers. No soft towels. Just layers of cloth and hope that it's not too cold that day. And if things don't go well, my condolences. Maternal mortality was high, and if a baby was born with visible deformities, the father had the right to decide whether it should be raised. In some cases, babies deemed unfit to live were left outside a practice called exposure. Don't ask too much about it unless you want to lose sleep tonight. Don't worry, we're telling this like a bedtime story softly. After giving birth, the mother had to go through a period of pollution lasting several days called catharsis. During this time, you were considered religiously impure, barred from temples, excluded from rituals, even limited from touching sacred food. Some women would be purified by smoke or by standing near fire. Not for warmth. To burn off negative energy. You've just escaped death, now you've got to survive a spiritual detox too. A full combo. Of course, there were tender moments. Women from the family would come to visit bringing bread, honey, and blessings. And the neighbors. They'd gossip that the baby has ears like Uncle Dion, or a nose just like Grandpa, while you fake a smile through the blood loss and full body ache. And remember, if the baby was a boy, the seventh day brought the naming ceremony called amphidromia. The whole household would walk around the hearth 3 times, lifting the baby high and introducing him to the ancestors. If it was a girl, well, there was a walk too, but shorter. Ancient Greece didn't score high on gender equality, as you may have guessed. So giving birth back then wasn't the sacred journey of motherhood you read about in pastel-colored modern books. It was a battle between pain gods, olive oil, bronze knives, and faith. If you survived your first birth, you were practically a superhero, and the community would treat you as a living milestone, a testament to human endurance. Even though you'd still have to wake up early the next morning to wash cloths, cook porridge, and tend the potty water, at least you'd officially joined the ranks of real women. And you know what? In ancient Greece, that was just as sacred as any miracle. You're sitting under the shade of an olive tree chewing the last bite of your dry afternoon bread when you hear your neighbor's parents call out, "She's 13 now." Time to think about marriage. You choke a little, and not because the bread is dry. Welcome to the marriage system of ancient Greece, where love is the stuff of poetry, but weddings are your father's business. If you were a young girl, condolences in advance, you would be married off around the age of 13 to 15. Not because you'd fallen in love, but because your father had completed the negotiations. And if you were a man, you'd marry around 30 once you had a house of trade and a belly large enough to prove you'd truly lived. So in ancient Greece, husbands and wives were often separated by an entire generation. You didn't marry for compatibility, you married because it was time. And if you're wondering, wait, what about love? Well, love was reserved for poetry theater or the neighbors. Here's an odd fact few people know. On the wedding night in Athens, the bride didn't get a clear look at the groom's face. Weddings were usually held at night under the dim glow of torches and hushed whispers like, "Hope the groom's family is pleased." Some said it added a touch of mystery. Others claimed it was so the bride wouldn't have time to run away. The girl would enter the groom's house led by his mother, the only woman she'd likely see for years. Because married women stayed home, cooked, bore children, and if lucky, kept a cat. Historians still debate the level of coercion in ancient Greek marriages. Some argue it was a socially accepted arrangement of the time. Others insist it was plainly about ownership, with women seen as property transferred from father to husband, called kyrios, meaning guardian. Even if her husband died, the wife wasn't free to stay single as she pleased. She might be forced to marry her husband's younger brother, not for romance, but to ensure the property stayed within the family. You sit there chewing stale bread, thinking about how some people today still complain about marriage pressure. Then you glance at the 14-year-old girl next door learning from her mother how to weave a wedding shawl. She doesn't know who Shakespeare is, but she's memorized the right blend of scents to charm her soon-to-be husband. You sigh, roll over on your side, and whisper, "True love in Athens. Not a chance." You're drifting off when a soft knock comes at the door. Not from a god, nor a philosopher. It's the neighbor's wife calling her husband to the fields. And just like that, the dream ends. Because in ancient Greece, before dawn even breaks, the farmer is already shouldering his hoe. There's no Valentine's Day, no morning coffee dates, only sweat, sunlight, stones, and a fragile hope that the goats won't destroy the crops today. You head out to the fields, which means walking several kilometers over a few hills on bare feet or sandals thinner than pastry paper. The air is still cool. Dew mixed with dust. And if you pause long enough, you might hear the birds and the sighs of hundreds of other farmers quietly wondering, am I planting seeds or planting karma? You carry 2 clay water jugs, a few simple tools, and the last bit of stale bread from yesterday. No 3-compartment lunchbox. No bottled spring water. If thirsty, you find a tree and drink from the goat leather pouch slung over your shoulder, the kind of water that if you forgot to clean the pouch yesterday, now tastes like fermented eggs. You plow the field with oxen if you're rich. But if you're poor, congratulations, you are the ox. You bend low, dragging the wooden plow through hardened soil, sweat staining your back in blotchy patches. Each row stretches endlessly. Each furrow a negotiation with the goddess Demeter. You whisper to yourself, I'm not lazy. I just was born in the wrong era. A strange custom few know. During droughts, the Greeks would lead a donkey or goat into the fields, decorate it with flowers, and then pretend to beat it as a way of coaxing pity from the rain god. Some regions even threw water on each other in the streets, hoping the sky would imitate. Festival or farce. That's for later. The fields still need tending. Historians still debate how free Greek farmers really were. Some records say farmers owned their land and took part in politics, but others claim most fertile land belonged to the aristocrats, while farmers lived on leased plots, and if they couldn't pay on time, you guessed it, debt became chains. Farming wasn't just a job. It was a condition of existence. You grew barley, beans, grapes, depending more on luck than soil. No fertilizer, no plowing machine, no crop insurance. Just hope and calloused hands. The sun climbs higher. You straighten your back after the last furrow. Dirt cakes your feet. Your shirt is soaked like you swam home, but you smile softly. Because nothing broke today. No goats trampled the field. No floods came. No one screamed a god's name in despair. You clap the dust from your hands, lift the empty water jug, and head home. On the way, you think of the evening with a bowl of beans, a bit of wine, and stories told by the wife who married you when you were 30 and she was 14. You chuckle quietly, not out of joy, but from exhaustion. You've just stepped through the door when a child's wailing splits the sky. Not yours, the neighbor's. But in ancient Athens, every child in the block was everyone's business. Because homes were small, walls were thin, and crying pierced through sun-baked clay. Raising children wasn't tender. A newborn was laid on the ground waiting for the father to pick them up. Not because the father had back pain, but because this was how one declared, I accept this child. If the father didn't pick them up, the child was rejected and left on the street where they might be eaten by animals or picked up to be raised as a slave. Sounds cruel. Back then it was population control. If raised, the child was breastfed by the mother, or if she was busy, a hired wet nurse. No diapers, just wrapped cloth. And if you've ever hand-washed fabric, imagine doing it without soap, without tap water, without a spin cycle. You go to the river, beat the cloth against the rocks, scrubbing. As you pray, Poseidon doesn't get angry. When done, you hang the cloth on a bush, and pray the wind doesn't carry your husband's underwear into a nobleman's courtyard. A strange fact few mention: in many places, women weren't allowed to leave the house alone. But they still had to go to the market. So how? They sent slaves in their place or snuck out early in the morning while the streets were still empty. Some even disguised themselves with thick cloaks covering their faces just to buy a few bunches of onions without being stared at like loose women. The market or agora wasn't just for buying and selling. It was the ancient version of social media. You didn't just go to buy beans. You went to hear war news, listen to philosophers argue, and see who was wearing purple-dyed robes, which meant wealth. You paid with coins, or if you had no money, with goods. Because here, a loaf of bread for 3 olives was microeconomics in action. No e-wallets. But still, fraudsters, counterfeit goods, and moon cycle discounts. Historians still debate the true level of domesticity for women. Some sources claim women stayed home, never went to market. But archaeology tells a different story. Traces of women running dye shops, selling perfumes, and playing roles in small-scale trade. Some scholars argue Athenian women were socially sanctioned. Others say they weren't immortalized in statues, but they kept the economy running. You return from the market arms full of beans, a pile of gossip, and one lingering question in your head. Did I just hear someone mention Socrates and then talk about throwing bricks? You don't get a chance to ponder because the baby starts crying again. You let out a long breath. Life in Athens is exhausting. Thankfully, there's a wine festival tonight. Hopefully it doesn't rain. You've just hung up the last of the laundry, not even sat down yet, when a soft voice calls from outside. Hey, the house next door got a new slave. Young, broad shoulders, looks useful. You sigh. In Athens, that's not even big news, because slaves were everywhere. So many that people used to say half of Athens was slaves, the other half was people who didn't have slaves yet. Unlike the image of chains and whips, we usually imagine slavery in ancient Greece was a complex concept. Some were captured in war. Some were sold as children. Some were born without ever having a choice. And whether working indoors or in the fields, slaves weren't helpers. They were property. You go to the market, the slave carries the goods. You bathe, the slave fetches the water. You sleep, the slave stokes the fire to cook beans for the next morning. And if you were rich, you might have a personal slave just to fix your sandals. If you were poor, then you were a slave to taxes. A strange fact few talk about. Some slaves were hired as accountants. And some slaves were richer than free people. It sounds backwards, but it's true. Some slaves were entrusted with managing shops, keeping records, even overseeing their master's assets. But no matter how intelligent they were, they had no legal rights. They couldn't sue, couldn't marry legally, couldn't choose to stay or leave. You could sell them, rent them out, or punish them with a stick for no reason at all. Historians still debate the cruelty of the Greek slave system. Some argue it was an economic mechanism not inherently evil. Others say you can't call a society enlightened when it was built on the backs of those not allowed to speak. In Sparta, slaves were called helots, outnumbering free citizens 20-1. Each year the government permitted young Spartans to hunt slaves as a training ritual. No reason. No court. Just daggers and the lesson that power is blood. You glance out the window and see a man carrying water down the street. Back bent, eyes lowered. You don't know where he came from, or even if he has a name. You only know that if he disappears tomorrow, no one will ask. And if someone new takes his place the day after, the street will carry on as usual. You bow your head and hurriedly gather the basket of greens. The wind passes through colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because you suddenly realize civilization at times is just light cast upon the darkness we choose to accept. You're about to lie down after washing your hands when you hear a strange noise from the house next door. Groaning, clattering, the sound of hot water being spilled in haste. You don't need to ask to know someone's fallen ill again. Back then, whenever someone got sick, the whole neighborhood knew. Not because people cared, but because the names of gods were called out like midday bells. Please, Asclepius, have mercy. Please don't let it be the plague. Please not the breathless kind. Healthcare in ancient Greece was a mix of philosophy, faith, and luck. If you had a headache, it might be poisoned wind. If you couldn't sleep, maybe you offended a god in your dreams. And if you coughed up blood, well, it was time to prepare wine, olive oil, and a farewell blessing. You didn't go to a hospital, because hospitals didn't exist. You called for a healer, a man in a cloak speaking in riddles, carrying a knife, a jar of vinegar, and a book of belief. He'd examine you by feeling your pulse with 3 fingers, checking the color of your tongue and asking, "Have you dreamed of dead fish lately?" If yes, your prescription would be garlic poultice oil scraping, and wait for the god to decide. A strange fact few people know. The Greeks used to sleep in temples to heal. You'd enter the Asclepion, the temple of the healing god, bathe in cold water, fast, and then sleep among other sick people, hoping the god would appear in your dreams and reveal the cure. If you dreamed of snakes slithering around your bed, congratulations, you'd recover. If you dreamed of being bitten by one, well, tough luck. Historians still debate how advanced Greek medicine really was. Some praise Hippocrates, who promoted observing symptoms and wrote the first ethical oath in medicine. But others counter, they understood the body but not bacteria. So mud packs, bloodletting, and phlegm extraction were still considered standard treatment. Got a stomachache? The healer would ask, "What did you eat this morning?" You'd say, "Beans boiled with wild greens." He'd nod, clearly an issue with black bile. And you'd receive a prescription of fig leaves clay and a recommendation to think positive thoughts. You'd leave the healer's house feeling lighter. Not because you were better, but because you survived being bloodlet with a bronze knife. You'd wonder, maybe tomorrow I'll try the watching the sea at sunset to cure cough remedy. You lie down, head on a half-stuffed straw pillow, thinking you're finally at peace. But you can't sleep, not because of the goat. Not even because of the drunk young men singing outside, but because you just remembered you passed the temple of Apollo today and didn't bow. You lie still, eyes wide open. In your mind, you see yourself being struck by lightning or turned into a singing shrub. Ancient Greeks didn't believe in gods. They lived with them. Gods were everywhere. In the wind, in the rain, in the fallen crumb, in the hiccup during sleep, and most importantly in dreams. So every action, what you eat, which road you take, even which direction you face when sleeping, could disturb a god, mid-dream. Did you fart in the middle of the night? You might have offended the wind god. Did you gossip about a neighbor Hermes, god of messages, might have overheard and tattled? Did you laugh when someone tripped? Very likely you'll be turned into a featherless rooster. A strange fact few know. Greeks had no concept of sin in the moral sense. Only hubris, the offense against the gods. You weren't hated for adultery. You were hated for thinking you didn't need the god of love. The gods didn't need you to be good. They just needed you to be afraid. You might ask, were there clear rules? No. Historians still debate the Greek belief system. Some say it was a flexible personal religion, but others insist it was a network of social fear where every act carried divine risk. Step on a piece of bread, it's over. Demeter's angry. Drink wine without pouring the first sip, it's over. Dionysus sulks. Sleep and dream of a pale figure, it's over. Now you must visit the temple to decode the dream or live in anxiety for 6 months. The Greeks burned incense, poured wine, and whispered god names every day, not out of love, but because without love there was no peace. Even offhanded vows like "I swear to Zeus" were considered dangerous if you didn't keep your word. However, the strangest thing of all is this: the Greek gods were extremely quick to anger. Zeus would strike lightning just for being mentioned without proper ritual. Hera was so jealous, she turned mortals into cows, birds, or stone. Artemis got angry when someone accidentally saw her bathing, and that person was turned into a deer, then hunted down by his own dogs. The gods here weren't loving father figures, they were a council of absolute power without warning and incredibly petty. The Greeks believed dreams were the gods' way of speaking. Dream of the sea. Poseidon wants a fish offering. Dream of fire. Hestia needs wine. Dream of the dead. Maybe Hades is reminding you forgot the candle last week. Even dreaming of nothing could leave you uneasy. What if the gods have forgotten me? So you rise again, take a bit of bread, some wine, and mumble a small offering at the doorway. No one taught you exactly what to do, but you do it because you want peace. You think to yourself, better to offer a crumb than wake up tomorrow as a lizard. You don't realize anything at all. The sun has set, the house darkens, and the person beside you, the one you love most, has just taken their last breath. You sit there trembling, not from cold, but from the knowledge of one thing. You don't have much time. In ancient Greece, death wasn't the end. It was a spiritual threshold, and if you crossed it without the proper rites, you'd be stuck forever between two worlds. Was the dead not buried? Their spirit would wander, hungry, thirsty, alone, and dangerous. The Greeks called them psyche, restless souls still roaming among us. You quickly cover the body with a white cloth, clean the hands and feet, burn incense, place a small coin under the tongue, the fee for Charon the ferryman, who guides souls across the river Styx. No coin. The soul would be stranded on the shore seeing the other side, but never able to cross. A strange fact few people know. In certain rituals, if the dead weren't properly buried, the living could suffer nightmares for days. No one dared call it coincidence. They believed the departed were knocking at the door. Historians still debate the true role of Greek funerary rites. Some claim they were merely symbolic customs, but others insist this was a socio-spiritual system designed to keep souls within boundaries. You didn't want a dead loved one to return not because you hated them, but because a lonely soul could easily become dangerous. However, in some places the Greeks weren't afraid of spirits. They invited them. We shift gently now to one of the strangest places, the healing temple of Asclepion. You're in pain, from no clear cause. Doctors can't help. You're taken to a temple where healing comes not only through medicine, but through dreams. There you bathe fast, pray, then sleep on cold stone among other sick people. You hope the god Asclepius will appear in your dream and touch you. But what you fear more is which god else might show up. An omen-bearing deity, an unburied soul, or a white figure that just stands and watches you all night. Many claimed they dreamed of snakes, sacred symbols of healing. Some dreamed of deceased loved ones whispering, "It's not time yet." They'd wake up either healed or a step weaker. And this is where the debate begins. Some scholars argue Asclepion was the earliest model of psychotherapy plus dream therapy, a place where people healed through hope. But others counter, this wasn't science. It was spiritualizing illness, and dangerous because the sick weren't truly cured. You lying in the somber space of stone and incense smoke don't know where you stand in all those theories. You only know you're too exhausted to tell what's real and what's not. And if someone were to step out of your dream, reach out a hand and say, "I can heal you," you'd nod and follow. You wake with the first light of dawn, not because of an alarm clock, but because of roosters crowing, the pounding of rice, and someone next door arguing over burnt bread. You're not a Spartan warrior, not an Athenian philosopher. You're an ancient Greek woman. And if you think your day will begin with meditation, herbal tea, and 3 minutes of gratitude journaling, you might as well go back to sleep. First task of the day. Fetching water. No faucets, no electric kettles. You carry a clay jug larger than your upper arm, trudge across a dusty yard full of chickens, and queue at the public well where about 20 other women are side-eyeing each other to see who arrived first. Remember the story of the gods fighting over a golden Apple Watch? Women line up for water in the morning. You'll see divine warfare is a daily affair. Back home with a jug that somehow feels heavier than before you do the laundry. No floral-scented detergent. You have water stones and your hands. Doing laundry means slap, slap, slapping on a rock, scrubbing, wringing, slapping again, then hanging it on a rope or the nearest bush. The smell. Well, you live in a place where people believe a dab of perfume on your tunic is enough to mask reality. Spoiler, it's not. Next up, cooking. Don't picture a cozy kitchen with cast iron pots and soft amber lights. You have a corner wall, a few glowing embers, and a clay pot that each time it cracks makes you silently mourn inside. What do you cook? Rough bread, barley, porridge, boiled greens, beans, if you're lucky, fish if the gods are smiling. You season with salt, olive oil, and a prayer that no one notices you forgot an ingredient. And children, you raise them. Of course, ancient Greek kids had no daycare, no YouTube kids, no Miss Google. They had mothers and a dusty courtyard to fall in. You feed them, teach them to avoid fire, stop them from chasing dogs, and sometimes threaten them with Zeus lightning if they don't take a nap. If you're slightly more well off, congratulations. You still can't leave the house unless escorted by a man, but at least you have slaves to help and you can embroider in the inner courtyard while exchanging gossip. If you're poorer, you go to the market to sell, carrying vegetables, bread, wool, or jars of oil to shout over the sea of noise. No display shelves, no cash registers, just sundust noise and haggling battles that could last longer than an epic war. A strange fact. Few people know. In some regions, women were such skilled traders, they became the main breadwinners of their families. They weren't allowed to vote, nor speak in council, but they knew the price of every fish, every bunch of herbs, and exactly where to get the cheapest purple cloth. And if someone asked, "Women just stay at home, right?" you had every right to laugh. Because that house, the one still standing, you're the one keeping it from falling apart. Historians still debate whether ancient Greek women were truly confined to the home. One side claims women were strictly controlled, denied education, and not allowed outside. The other side argues many women participated in the economy and religion and had a voice in the community, they just didn't get their names carved into stone. And between those arguments, you, a woman weaving under the shadow of an olive tree, simply sigh. You gentlemen can keep debating. I've got a dozen things left to do. Evening falls. You breathe a quiet relief as the last child dozes off, the fire dies down, and the chickens stop demanding food. You have exactly 2 minutes to look up at the sky and think that if Hera weren't busy being jealous, she'd probably be doing housework too. You're lighting an oil lamp in a small stone courtyard, surrounded by chipped white walls and the faint scent of incense rising from a bronze censer. No one's carving your name into a monument. No one's writing you into the history books. But without you, the ritual can't begin. You are an ancient Greek woman. And you are the keeper of the flame. Not just metaphorically, but quite literally, the sacred flame, the kitchen fire, the temple hearth. Even though ancient Greek society was largely male-dominated, women played a vital role in religious life. In other words, they couldn't vote, but they could pray on behalf of the entire village. In Athens, that shining beacon of democracy and high philosophy, women were still the ones who made the most sacred rites possible. They weren't goddesses, but they tended to the goddesses. Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Artemis, protector of young women. And of course the queen atop Olympus, Hera. Your work. Silent, precise, and under pressure. You must prepare offerings, clean the temple, wash ritual cloths, blend incense, brew ceremonial wine, scatter herbs, and absolutely not let a cat jump on the altar. Ancient Greece had no express divine sanitation services. You might be a kenephoros, a basket-bearing maiden in a procession chosen from noble families, or a priestess, a woman who serves as the bridge between the divine and the community. Sounds powerful. In reality, you must live with strict discipline, remain unmarried, never leave the sanctuary, and sometimes follow a special diet for years. A strange fact few people know. At Eleusis, home to the most secretive rituals in the Greek world, both men and women could participate. But only women held certain top-secret roles, especially in the rites of rebirth that symbolized the cycle of crops and life. Meaning, in a male-centered society, it was women who guarded the gate of reincarnation. Historians still debate, was women's religious role truly empowerment, or just a safe zone society permitted them to have a voice? One side argues, it proves reverence for women in the spiritual realm. The other side raises an eyebrow. How many priestesses got their names in the epics, huh? But you, carrying the ritual wine, eyes drifting through swirls of incense, don't argue. You know the sacred doesn't need a plaque. You stand within the right, within the community, between the divine and the mundane. One wrong move, and the gods might be displeased. The ancient Greeks believed that if a ritual went wrong, crops would fail, cities would suffer, and divine protection would be withdrawn. So no matter who was king, who was warrior, they waited for you to light the torch first. And sometimes when all is quiet, you'll look up at the statue of the goddess, whisper an ancient phrase, then gently pull back your veil, letting the incense wrap around your shoulders. No one records it, but you know someone was listening. You walk barefoot on cold stone where footsteps before you have worn paths for centuries. Around you, flickering oil lamps reflect on damp walls, casting shadows of still figures as if they've turned to stone, their prayers suspended in silence. You're not in a hospital. You're in an ancient Greek healing temple. No white beds, no doctors in lab coats, no neat prescriptions written on iPads. Here the treatment is sleep, but not for rest, for dreaming. The Greeks believed that in dreams, the gods, especially Asclepius, the god of medicine, would appear to diagnose illness and offer guidance. You didn't come for a medical checkup. You came to lie down, close your eyes, and wait for a miracle to visit your sleep. Before you were allowed to sleep, there was much to do. Bathe in sacred spring water. Fast for several days. Cleanse your body and your mind. Sometimes even offer a chicken a lock of hair, or a promise to make an offering if you were healed. And actually, if you were healed, you'd be expected to carve that gratitude into stone. Once clean and calm, you were led into a room called the abaton, a communal sleeping chamber. No soft mattress, just stone floors, or if lucky, a layer of dry straw. And around you the sound of breath, others also searching for the miraculous. Some dreamed the god touched their wound and woke up healed. Some heard a voice at midnight telling them to walk to the eastern hill where the real cure awaited. Some dreamed nothing, but after a few days, suddenly felt well again. You didn't know if it was psychology, the power of belief, or your body healing itself. You didn't care. In an age where no one knew bacteria and scalpels weren't sterilized, dreams were the safest medicine you had. In many temples, after the dream, you'd tell a priest. They would interpret the dream symbols like a physician astrologer. Dreamt of a snake coiled around your neck. The god is drawing poison from your lungs. Dreamt of drinking water from the hands of a blind man. You're being healed from an old memory. Every image had meaning. Every whisper in sleep might be divine instruction. And if you truly recovered, you'd be encouraged to carve your story into a stone tablet for others to read. Not to boast, but so others could believe I might be healed too. Sounds like a modern meditation meets therapy retreat. The only difference is here snakes slither around. Non-venomous snakes were released in the temple symbols of rebirth and healing. The strangest thing is, though belief was paramount, the Greeks held a miraculous truth. Some illnesses could not be cured if the mind wasn't open. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, educated or not in the temple. You were someone seeking balance. And perhaps the most comforting thought, no matter what you dreamed, no matter if the god appeared or not, you had already been allowed to rest in a place where faith was free to breathe evenly. You're standing under the noonday sun of ancient Greece, and your skin has officially surrendered. The sunlight pours down, as if Helios himself, the sun god, has switched on his high beams just for you for reasons only he understands. The air has thickened like overcooked peach jam. And you're sweating not because you ran, but because you exist. The climate of ancient Greece was classic Mediterranean summers, so dry and hot they cracked the ground like fired pottery, and winters well damp cold, and especially cruel when you had no coat or central heating. Modern romantics dream of brilliant golden days on the island of Santorini. But if you were a farmer in Attica 200 to 500 years ago, sunlight meant one thing: thirst and a late harvest. In summer, the earth dried to the point that a simple kick could stir up enough dust to make you cough like you were auditioning for a Sophoclean tragedy. No mist fans, no air conditioning. You covered your head with a cloth like a wandering artist and hoped the sea breeze would have mercy. But no, the sun had already beaten the wind. Each gust felt like an oven exhaling in your face. Ancient Greeks lived by the agricultural calendar, and weather ruled all. A summer that dragged on too long meant not enough barley to survive the winter. And you know what happens when an entire village goes hungry? They pray to Demeter. They offer sacrifices. And when there's nothing left to give, they offer fear. Winter wasn't much kinder. Cold winds blew down from the north, slicing through layers of linen like Boreas, the north wind god, was having a tantrum because someone stole his wine. Greek homes had no insulation, no glass windows, just wooden shutters and prayers that the rain wouldn't hit sideways. You curled up on mats or dry straw wrapped in wool blankets, if you had them, hoping mice didn't come cuddle too. Strangely, despite the heat, ancient Greeks didn't like going shirtless. They wore long chitons with wide sleeves wrapped like an elaborate tablecloth. Part culture, part superstition, they believed covering up shielded them from the sun. Some even wore 2 layers in summer. That's right too. Maybe to prove resilience, or maybe because they'd never heard of breathable fabrics. In city-states like Sparta and Athens, weather even shaped military training. Young Spartans drilled under furnace-like sun, bare-chested and barefoot. Why? To toughen the will and prove. If you don't faint today, you might survive the battlefield tomorrow. A logic uniquely Spartan. Even festivals and sacred rituals bowed to the weather. The Eleusinian Mysteries. One of the most sacred rites for Demeter and Persephone only took place when the harvest was bountiful. If the weather was too harsh and crops failed, the ceremony was postponed as if to whisper, "The gods aren't in the mood. Wait a bit longer." In the countryside, farmers rose at dawn to avoid the sun. They worked before the dew evaporated and the ground turned to a skillet. But by noon, you were practically roasting on your own land. In some places, people used large stones to shade plants, and when stones ran out, they used their bodies. Some modern scholars still debate how much climate contributed to the collapse of late Bronze Age civilizations. One theory suggests centuries-long droughts depleted water and agriculture, leading to war and ruin. Others argue overuse of land disasters and local climate shifts were the real cause. And while scholars bicker, you ancient Greek are still pulling water from the well, wiping your brow and wondering, did anyone offer enough sacrifices this season? In short, living in ancient Greece meant straddling two extremes, searing heat and bone-deep chill. You couldn't control the weather, you adapted to it. Through rituals, routines, and the stubborn resilience of the Mediterranean soul. If today you turn on the AC, pull the curtains, and sip chilled coconut water, remember your ancestors in Athens once braved the sun, braced against wind, and yes, wore 2 layers in July just to stay alive. And at night, when you lie on your memory foam mattress, set your sleep mode and groan. It's too hot today. Imagine yourself lying on a straw mat, resting your head on an old cloak, staring at a ceiling of dried olive wood. The crickets chirp in the distance. The scent of dust and olive oil lingers. But don't worry, no one's calling you to the agora tomorrow. No courtroom awaits. And even if you forgot to pay your worship tax, no one's carving your name into stone. So exhale softly. Even if today felt as tangled as a scroll of papyrus, you still deserve a gentle night. Sleep well. And if you dream of Zeus asking for festival funds, just tell him you're already asleep.